Imagine flying through freezing air at 25,000 feet, hearing nothing but the engines and the rattle of flak against the fuselage. The oxygen mask burns your face, your hands are numb, and below you, somewhere in the grey mist, are hundreds of German guns waiting. You don't know if you'll see home again. For the men of the B-17 Flying Fortress, every mission was a coin toss between life and death. And yet, they went up anyway. Fact 1. The sky felt alive. The first time a rookie crew flew over Germany, they said the sky itself seemed alive, black puffs of flak bursting like thunderclaps around them. The plane shook violently, aluminum skin rippling under the pressure. Inside, each man clung to his role, the pilot steady on the controls, the bombardier staring into the northern sight, the gunners scanning the clouds. They could see other fortresses burning, spiraling down, men falling with white parachutes that never fully opened. But no one said a word. Just the sound of the engines, the heartbeat of 17 tons of metal trying to stay in the air. Fact 2. Coffee before hell. At the English airfields, dawn always smelled of coffee, cold diesel, and fear. The crews gathered in briefing rooms, the windows blacked out. When the curtain was pulled, a red line appeared on the map, today's target. Some men cursed quietly, others stared blankly, already somewhere far away. They signed their names for survival kits, joked about coming back for dinner, and climbed aboard their flying fortresses, knowing that, for some, that cup of coffee had been the last warm thing they'd ever taste. Fact 3. Frozen courage. At 20,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 below. Gunners' hands froze to the metal handles. Blood froze instantly if shrapnel hit. The oxygen masks iced over, and men sometimes passed out without warning. Yet they stayed at their posts, scanning the empty sky for enemy fighters. When a Messerschmitt appeared, it was like a flash of lightning, here, then gone, and you had half a second to fire. Those who survived said courage didn't feel like bravery up there. It felt like holding on just long enough to get home, or to die with your crew still fighting beside you. Fact 4. When engines prayed. Every crewman knew the rhythm of their engines like a heartbeat. The B-17 had 4, each one a fragile lifeline over enemy territory. When one sputtered, men went silent. When 2 coughed, they began to pray. Pilots whispered to the engines as if to living beings, coaxing them to keep turning. Sometimes, after a flak burst, oil would spray across the windshield like dark rain, and the crew would feel the fortress tilt, heavy, wounded, but still flying. They called it riding a dying bird, and when it somehow made it back across the channel, the entire base would cheer, because everyone knew that plane had come home on faith. Fact 5. The empty seat. There was always one bunk left untouched in the barracks. A pillow unwrinkled, a blanket neatly folded. It belonged to whoever hadn't come back that week. Crews didn't talk about it much. They'd just walk in after a mission, still half deaf from the engines, glance at the empty bed, and understand. The personal things stayed. A photo, a deck of cards, a letter from home. Someone would quietly pack them into a small box, and the next day, another new face would appear in that bunk, smiling nervously, trying not to notice how quiet the room had become. Fact 6. Letters never sent. In the ready rooms, there were small wooden boxes marked, "In case I don't return." Every man wrote a letter and left it there. To his mother, his wife, a girl from home. The words were simple. "Don't worry about me. I did my best." The base chaplain collected those letters every few weeks. Some went out. Most didn't have to. But every man knew the weight of that envelope. It was the last piece of themselves they could control, in a world spinning out of it. Some even joked about what they'd write, but when night came and the base was quiet, you could see the glow of their lamps through the barracks windows, and no one was joking anymore. Fact 7. The long way back. After a bombing run, coming home was its own war. Fuel low, wings shredded, crews frostbitten and bleeding. They still had to cross hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Sometimes the fortress limped home on 2 engines, dragging itself through the sky at barely 150 miles an hour. Other times, the navigator couldn't see the coast for clouds and smoke. When they finally saw England, green fields through breaks in the fog, someone would always yell, "Land of the living!" They'd hit the runway on flat tires, slide to a stop, and only then realize they'd been holding their breath for hours. Fact 8. The ones who never slept again. Even on solid ground, the war didn't leave them. Pilots woke up at night hearing the engines. Gunners flinched at thunder, mistaking it for flak. Some couldn't sit in a movie theater. The darkness felt too much like the sky at 25,000 feet. They had survived what thousands hadn't. But survival came with ghosts. Men who had once laughed loudly in the mess hall now sat quietly, stirring their coffee for minutes at a time. They had flown through hell and made it back. But part of them was still up there, frozen in the clouds. Fact 9. The sound of flak. The veterans could still describe it decades later, that sound. The dry metallic crack of flak exploding near the fuselage. Then the eerie rain of shrapnel clattering across the wings. The sky above Germany was thick with it. Black blossoms that seemed to bloom just where you were flying. Crews learned to read those blossoms like weather signs. Too close, and you were already in the kill zone. They'd tighten their straps, grit their teeth, and trust the pilot's hands. There was no maneuvering out of it. You just flew straight through the storm and hoped your number wasn't written on one of those shells. Afterward, the silence inside the plane felt wrong, like the air itself was listening for the next hit. Fact 10. Brotherhood in the cold. They came from everywhere. Kansas farms, New York streets, California beaches, and somehow ended up in the same cramped steel cage, thousands of feet over Europe. The cockpit smelled of sweat, gun oil, and frozen leather. They barely knew each other at first, but after the first mission, after the first man screamed over the intercom that he was hit, they became something closer than family. They shared cigarettes in silence, divided rations, and read each other's mail when one was too shaken to hold it steady. They didn't talk about courage. They didn't need to. It was there in the way they reached for each other when the sky turned red. Fact 11. When the fortress bled. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for a reason. It could take punishment that would tear other planes apart. Crews told stories of fortresses flying home with entire sections missing. Tails shredded, holes big enough to crawl through, engines trailing fire. One gunner described looking down mid-flight and seeing daylight through the floor. It was like flying a sieve, he said, and yet, somehow, the plane stayed in the air. The mechanics called it luck, the pilots called it faith, the crews called it the fortress herself, as if the machine was alive, fighting to bring them home just as they fought to keep her flying. Fact 12. The ball turret prison. At the very bottom of the B-17 hung a glass sphere, the ball turret. The smallest space on the plane, barely big enough for a man to curl into. It was suspended between life and death, with nothing but air and gunfire below. The gunner sat in there for hours, knees at his chest, frozen fingers gripping twin .50 caliber guns, scanning the skies for enemy fighters. If the landing gear jammed, there was no escape. Many men refused the position. Others took it quietly, never speaking of it again. Those who survived said it changed them. Not the shooting, not the fear, but the feeling of hanging between the clouds and the earth, utterly alone, waiting for the next shadow to kill or be killed. Fact 13. Smoke over Schweinfurt. Schweinfurt, the name alone made every B-17 crew tighten their jaws. The city was home to Germany's ball bearing factories, and it was one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. On those missions, the air turned black with smoke and shrapnel before they even reached the target. Dozens of fortresses were hit before the bomb bay doors opened. Crews dropped their payloads through a haze of fire, unable to see if they'd even hit the mark. Returning home, the formation looked like broken wings, limping aircraft, engines sputtering, some crews too wounded to answer on the radio. When they landed, the airfield fell silent. Out of 100 planes, sometimes less than half came back. No one celebrated, just quiet relief and the sound of hissing metal cooling in the night air. Fact 14. The German voice on the radio. As the bombers crossed into occupied territory, a strange voice often cut through their radios. Smooth, calm, speaking perfect English. "Good morning, boys," she'd say. "You're flying into a beautiful day for dying." They called her Axis Sally, a German propagandist whose broadcasts mixed jazz music with mockery, reading out the names of real American units, sometimes even calling out pilots by name. It chilled the men to their bones. It meant the enemy knew who they were, where they were flying, and maybe where they'd fall. But instead of breaking them, it hardened them. Crews would twist the dial, grin through their nerves and say, "She can talk all she wants. She still has to hit us." Fact 15. The man in the parachute. Sometimes, when a B-17 went down, another crew would see a tiny white bloom below, a parachute drifting through smoke. For a few seconds, it was a spark of hope. Someone made it out. But over enemy territory, that silk could mean death too. Civilians, angry and frightened, sometimes waited below. Others, farmers, even children, would run to help. The men who fell called it the longest fall in the world. You had time to think about everything: your home, your mother, the sound of the engines you'd never hear again. Some were captured and spent years behind barbed wire. Others vanished completely, names carved later into marble walls marked "missing in action." Fact 16. Whiskey and silence. When a mission ended, the surviving crews gathered in the mess hall. The smell of burnt coffee, the clink of metal trays, and silence.
A chaplain read the list of those who didn't return. No one spoke, but everyone counted the names they knew. Then the whiskey came out, not for celebration, but for numbness. Someone might tell a joke, too loud, too fast, trying to drown out the empty chairs. Outside, the ground crews worked under lamps, patching holes, cleaning blood from the floor panels, reloading the guns for the next morning. There was no pause between death and duty. The war didn't allow it. The only thing that mattered was that when dawn came, the same men, fewer now, would climb back into their fortresses and fly again. Fact 17. The ground crew's prayer. They never flew, but they lived every mission. The ground crews, mechanics, armourers, fuelmen, watched their fortresses lift off in the pale dawn and counted them back one by one. When the last roar faded over the channel, they'd stand in silence, staring at the empty sky. Then came the waiting, hours of it. When the first black
dots appeared on the horizon, the airfield would come alive. They could tell from a distance which planes were hurt, one wing dipping, smoke trailing. They ran to the runways, waving flares, guiding the wounded birds home. And when a plane came in on its belly, sparks flying, they dropped everything to drag the crew out. They were the first to touch the heroes who made it back, and the last to close the hatches on those who didn't. Fact 18. Prisoners in the sky. For those shot down and captured, the war took on a new rhythm, one of hunger, boredom, and endless counting of days. The Luftwaffe camps were cold, fenced, and silent at night, except for the wind over barbed wire. The guards weren't always cruel. Sometimes they were just tired men, too. Inside, the prisoners built small worlds, chessboards from wood scraps, radios from stolen parts, drawings of home pinned to the walls. They spoke of missions, of planes, of the smell of engine oil, things that made them feel alive. Every night, they'd look up at the sky and listen for the sound of bombers overhead, whispering, "Keep going, boys. Don't stop." Because even behind the wire, they were still part of the fight. Fact 19. The fortress that wouldn't die. One mission over Bremen became legend. A B-17, named Ye Old Pub, took brutal fire, engines hit, nose torn open, the tail nearly gone. The crew half dead, the pilot unconscious, the plane falling apart. But somehow it stayed in the air. Then something unimaginable happened. A German fighter pulled up alongside, its pilot, Franz Stiegler, ready to finish them off. But when he saw the wounded men inside, he couldn't do it. He saluted instead and escorted the crippled bomber to the edge of the sea, sparing their lives. The two pilots met again, not as enemies, 40 years later. That day became a quiet symbol of humanity in the middle of hell, of two soldiers who understood that war had rules, but mercy had none. Fact 20. The return home. When the war finally ended, the skies fell silent. The fortresses, once symbols of strength, sat rusting on airfields, lined up like ghosts. Crews were sent home, one by one, quietly, without parades. They stepped off ships and trains, carrying duffel bags full of nothing but old letters and memories. Families hugged them like heroes, but most couldn't explain what they'd seen. Some became farmers, mechanics, teachers. Others never found peace again. In small towns across America, they gathered at diners or veterans' halls, talking about the missions,
in voices that trembled between pride and sorrow. They were boys when they went up, and old men when they came down. The sky had taken something from each of them, and left them forever looking upward. Fact 21. The last formation. After the war, they met once a year, fewer every time. Old jackets out of closets, medals in small cases, hands that
shook when they poured coffee. They brought photos worn thin at the edges, pointed at faces, and spoke the names softly, like a roll call. At air shows, they stood under restored fortresses, running their fingers over warm aluminium, counting the rivets as if they were prayers. The stories came out in short bursts. A joke about a navigator, a 5-second silence for a gunner. When the engine started, the crowd cheered. The veterans didn't. They just closed their eyes and listened, each hearing a different sky, a different day, a different friend who never came home. Fact 22. When 4 engines start. A modern pilot invites an old B-17 captain to climb aboard one last time. The ladder is harder now. The cockpit smells the same: oil, leather, dust and sun. Someone hands him a headset. Out on the field, the props spin, one by one, coughing to life. The old man puts a hand on the throttle but doesn't push it. He's not going anywhere. He's already there. In the cold, in the noise, in the narrow aisle where boys became brothers. He whispers something that sounds like a thank you. Not to the plane, not to himself. To the ones who stayed in the clouds. The engines settle into that steady, living heartbeat, and for a moment, the world is 25,000 feet high again. Some iron birds never returned, but the men who flew them left their sound in the sky, and it's still there if you listen. A low, steady hum that says courage is ordinary until it's asked to fly.